This is Pastor Scott Conway at QX Church. Thank you for being here for Grief Part 2. Of course, as we talked about last time, we're doing this series right now because we've been touched at our periphery with the loss of someone connected to our circles, and I've recently had the responsibility of pastoring and being there for the family and friends and doing a funeral, and with some of the challenges of being there for people in grief, and some of the things that have unfortunately gone on in circles, to spend a little bit of time talking about and preparing people to be able to be around for people who are going through crisis, who are going through difficult times, who are suffering this kind of loss. Last time we talked about rule number 1, let them grieve. The way out is through, and to just be with them. Let them feel and guide only actions. We reminded everyone that grief is very individual. It can be immediate or delayed, and the classic 5 stages of grief of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, and how this isn't necessarily a path, but as much of anything a reminder that we shouldn't be surprised at whatever someone's feeling, whatever someone's going through. We shouldn't be surprised if someone's in denial. We shouldn't be surprised if someone's angry. We shouldn't be surprised if someone's wishing they could make a trade. We shouldn't be surprised if someone's depressed, and we also shouldn't be surprised if someone reaches acceptance really fast. We shouldn't be surprised if people get stuck, and as a reminder that we don't get to decide how someone else grieves, and we don't get to decide how someone else recovers. And that most people, most of the time with most loss, are pretty resilient, and they do recover. In this lesson, we start off with some more fundamentals on being there for someone else who is grieving. Being there through someone else's grief. Now, all of the things we did last time and this time are what you do when you are the one being there for someone. Next time we'll start talking about going through your own grieving process. Now, I will admit, and I'll certainly be the first one to admit, being there for people in grief is a little bit more challenging when you are also grieving. Because I was one of the last ones to have ongoing conversations with the young lady that we lost. Because I was just getting to know her better. She was just beginning to be around more, to train more, to seek coaching and counseling more. That our relationship, our connections were moving forward, our connections were increasing. And I had the privilege of talking to her. I had the privilege of answering questions for her. And suddenly she's gone. And so I'm in the middle of my own grieving process. Now, I am very resilient. I do tend to recover. And we weren't close friends. We weren't emotionally connected. And so that makes my grieving process much lighter than many others. But I was still in a grieving process when I'm being there for the family. And I'm still in a grieving process while I'm being there for her close friends. And I was still in my own grieving process when I'm doing her funeral. Underscored even more because I'm doing her funeral on the exact same day that I had my next appointment with her. So some of these things, well, on an intellectual level, when we're not going through anything, might seem pretty self-evident, but we also may never have thought of it. But where the challenge is is when you're trying to be there for someone while you are also going through something. So if you're a friend of the person and you're trying to be there for the family, or if you're an acquaintance of the person and so you have some modest grief you're going through yourself, and you're as compared to someone else, and you're trying to be there for the close friends, or maybe you are a close friend and you're trying to be there for other close friends, that learning some of these things and really giving it some thought, thinking about it at a deeper level, so that even if you're a little bit rattled, if you're a little unsettled yourself because you're going through a little bit of something, and you're trying to be there for someone else, then you can be ready to be there even when you're feeling a little empty yourself. And that you can continue to offer comfort, even at the same time that maybe you might need comfort. And that you can be there with and for the people whose grief is striking them deeper, whose pain is more intense, and be able to conduct yourself in a way that will be healthy for them and helpful for them. And then you seek your comfort from someone who hopefully is going through much less pain and less challenge than you are. Now here's one of the fundamentals, and we see this unfortunately all the time. We see this with people who are in crisis. We see this with people who are having problems and challenges of really any sort. And unfortunately, we also see this with people who are facing trauma, who are facing terminal diagnoses or serious risk, like going in for surgery that has risk involved. And we see this with people being there for others who are in grief, and that's this. They end up making it about themselves. So here is one of the key rules, is do not make it about you. Do not make it about you. So if you're going to be there for someone in grief, make sure it's not about you. Two of the most common sins, and we put sins in quotes there, two of the most common missing the bullseye, two of the most common mistakes, two of the most common wrongs we see people do with any kind of crisis is they make it about them, or they make it about their story, the story that they're telling. Hopefully, it would go without saying at an intellectual level that when someone else is going through something, do not make it about you. Now, the well-meaning reason we do this is relatability. So when people show up and they got going on their own thing, a lot of times if you ask them, say, well, why did you decide to make that about you? Well, they weren't thinking about making it about them. What they might have been thinking about is to be relatable, to let them know that I've been through something similar. But then once you get going on that, it's really easy to kind of keep going on that. And all of a sudden, you're talking about your own thing. All of a sudden, it's about what you want to say and what you want to share. And in a bizarre twist of events sometimes, the person who is grieving ends up being the one offering comfort to the person who is now sharing their own stuff, which is exactly the opposite of what we set out to do. So do not make it about you. If someone lost a parent, I might mention that I have also lost a parent. So they know that they can talk to me about it, but then I drop the story. I don't talk about it. I may just mention it. And so the fact that my father died of cancer when he was 45 years old, my grandmother died of cancer when she was 55 years old, and then I leave it. And if they want to talk about cancer, if they want to talk about losing parents, if they want to talk about that process, they know that I've been there. They know that I've had to go through some of that. I don't need to tell the story. I don't need to talk about it. I don't need to talk about what it felt like. I don't need to to go into my whole autobiography. I just need to drop enough information so they know. If you want to talk to me about it, I've given you enough information to know I'm someone who may be able to understand at least a part of what you're talking about. But that's it. I don't need to talk about how I felt about my father dying. I don't need to talk about how I felt about my grandmother dying. I don't need to talk about what it's like being in your teens or your 20s and losing a grandparent or losing a parent. I don't need to get into any of that. I just need to give them enough information, because the drive is the relatability. The drive is to let them know I've been through something similar enough to what you're going through that if you want to talk to someone who has some slice of this experience, you can talk to me. And that's all. That's the only purpose of it. And so for the relatability, I don't need to suddenly distract from the story that they're telling and what they're going through and then suddenly make it about my narrative, my autobiography, because I'm being there for them. I don't turn the story toward me. I keep the focus on them. I use the existence of my experience as a door for them. If they want to walk through that door and have that conversation, I've opened the door for them to use. Not for me to use, for them to use. So I don't lead them through the door and have that talk. I open the door for them so they feel like they want to have that talk. They can have that talk. And that's all. Closely related to this is this one. Do not make it about your story. Now, in some ways, this is even worse than making it about you. This is one of the other most common sins of people comforting people. We start telling stories we know. It's not even our own experience. We'll talk about this famous person or that famous person or our cousin or our friend. So it's not even our personal experience. And sometimes we get talking about things that happen to other people and we suddenly make it about that other story. When someone's going through something, do not make it about your story. It's not about the story I want to tell. It's not about the other person's experience I want to share. I'm supposed to be there for the person grieving. I'm supposed to be there for their crisis, their challenge, their difficulty. I'm not here to tell every story I've ever heard. I'm not here to relate a story from a movie, to relate a story from a documentary, to relate a story from the news, to relate a story I heard from my cousin, to relate a story I heard from my friend. The well-meaning reason we do this is to let people know that they're not alone. And that we know that they're not alone. We want them to know they're not alone, and we want them to know that we know they're not alone. But too often it turns into a focus on the other story. And it can sometimes get preachy. I mean, this is the challenge that we really run into when we're telling other people's stories, because we have enough emotional disconnect from the other story so that we're not really feeling it. At least when we're sharing our own story of what we went through, we might be talking about our feelings. And we might be able to relate and connect. But when we're talking about other people's stories, we tend to talk about principles. We tend to talk about ideas. And when we're doing that to someone who is grieving, we're trying to yank them out of their emotion and tell them, well, this is what these other people did. It's not even our own personal experience. And we lose the relatability because it's not us having been there, done that, know what it feels like. We're just telling a story that we heard. And we tend to be more emotionally disconnected from stories we heard. And what we end up doing is someone who's going through deep emotion And we're telling stories that we're relatively unemotional about. Now, we might be passionate about it, but not because we went through it, but more because we have opinions about it. And that preachy part is talking about, well, what they did. Almost implying, or sometimes flat out saying, this is what you need to do. And sometimes we use those stories as a resource for theology. We use that story as a resource for logic. We use that story as a resource for platitudes. And we just dump it on someone who's grieving. And we don't do that. This is part of why I'm leading today with these two things, is because these are two of the most common things we see again and again and again. And it's not just something we do when people are grieving like a loss, a death. These are things that we see all the time when people are in crisis, when people are facing some massive challenge, some massive difficulty. And we may start off well-meaning enough for the relatability and you're not alone, and then we just get going on our story. And we just get going on the story that we're telling, which might not even be our story. And every once in a while, on either one of these, it gets even worse than that. Because then we're launching from one story to another story, which reminds us of another story. Now, all of us have done like the rabbit trail thing, where you start a conversation over here, and at some point down the line, you realize you're talking about something way over there, and you may not always be sure quite how you got there. I mean, all of us have had this experience. I mean, I've had times where half an hour into a conversation, we're going, how in the world did we get on this subject? And then you try to backtrack and figure, oh, okay, we're talking about this, and we've said that, which reminded of this movie, which we talked about that, which reminded, oh yeah, of that other thing. Okay, I see how we got there. I mean, when you're having like online discussions, and you can actually go back through your thread and say, how did we make the jump from there? So most of us who have conversations with people, we have this experience. And imagine if you're trying to be there for someone in grief, someone who's in crisis, someone who's in pain. And that not only do you start talking about yourself, and then you end up telling a story, then you're jumping to the next subject and the next subject, and before you know it, you realize you're talking about something completely unrelated to anything. And you may have been there with them for half an hour and just been talking about wherever your conversation goes, instead of being there for them. Now, another thing, and this is more of a pastor thing, believer thing in general, is if you plan to pray for someone, like live and in person, be there with them, praying with them, putting your hand on them and praying, bowing your head as a group or as a pair and praying, ask first. Ask first. Ask if you can pray. Is during times of crisis, I may or may not even offer to pray with someone. If I already know that this isn't really someone I pray with, that this is someone who will not take it well, I may already know, okay, don't offer to pray with them. Now, much, much more common than that is, I think, well, they might like it. They might be open to it. And then I will ask. They usually accept, but not always, not always. Non-believers in particular, of course, often don't want someone to pray out loud with them because non-believers, especially, strong non-believers, who think of God as my imaginary friend, kind of think it's bizarre that, they would consent to me praying to an imaginary friend. They might like it at a psychological level that I'm there to comfort them, but they don't want me praying to my imaginary friend. I mean, you can imagine how most of us believers would feel if someone says, is it okay with you if we bow our heads and we pray to Zeus? Most of us go, okay, if you want to, but it doesn't mean anything to us. Or someone says, is it okay with you if we bow our heads and we pray to my car? And we go like, that's kind of weird, actually. Can we, no? Right? And so if someone really sincerely does not believe in God, or they really sincerely do not believe in Jesus Christ, even if they may believe generically in God, they may not want an overtly Christian prayer. And sometimes I'm perfectly willing to pray a much more generic God prayer. But even believers, sometimes believers don't want prayer because they're angry with God. They're furious at God for allowing something to happen. And sometimes they're even more furious at God because the bad thing that happened was a direct violation of whatever theology that they learned. Maybe they have been taught, I mean, certainly you wouldn't get this lesson around here, but maybe they've been taught that if you're a good person, God will bless you, and then some terrible thing happens. And they're furious because they were doing what they were told they need to do. They're in the Word of God, and they're reading the Bible every single day. They're in communion with God every single day. Maybe they're doing communion as well as praying every single day. They're walking in obedience, and that they were told that this will lead to joy. They were told that this leads to a hedge of protection around you. And that's the theology that they had. And then some terrible thing happens. Even worse, when the terrible thing happens to the man of God or the woman of God, while some good thing happens or no bad thing happens to the person who is walking in open defiance of all biblical standards. And they're mad at God. And so sometimes even believers don't want prayer. So ask. Get their permission first. Now here's a huge thing about praying for someone out loud. Before you pray for them out loud and in person, remember all of the same do not rules apply. Now you can always pray for someone privately. Whatever your theology, whatever your belief, if you are in your prayer closet praying, and you know, if you're not familiar with that term, it doesn't have to literally be a closet. I know some people have watched the movie The War Room and they think, oh, my prayer closet has to literally be a closet. But you know, if what we're talking about is in your private prayers, in your prayers that aren't in the presence of the people, when you're not saying stuff out loud other people can hear, you can pray however you like. You pray in whatever connects you to God. But when you're with people, what you speak out loud in prayer is part of what you are speaking to this person. So all of the same do not rules apply to praying out loud with people. All the do not rules about not making it about you apply. So if I'm praying for a family in grief, I'm not praying to God and suddenly using my prayer as an excuse to be telling my story. I don't use prayer as an excuse to start talking about whatever other story I know. I mean, there's already kind of this problem we have in prayer circles where they become gossip circles. Like, well, you know, you need to pray for so-and-so because you know what I heard? Where people sometimes use prayer to hide behind God and hide behind the idea of compassion, because I'm praying for them, right? To then break other rules. So we have to be aware that when we're praying to God, but in the presence of other people, and we're praying out loud, we have an audience. And if people's heads are bowed, and they're being quiet while they're listening to the prayer, that what we are speaking to God may have a different level of impact. So we need to make sure we are still following the same rules. The do not rules of all the things you do not do. And then there's more. We're going to get into those shortly. All of the do not rules are judgment calls. So even the part about don't tell your story, don't get into telling other people's stories, and all the ones that are about to follow are judgment calls. It means you might break them sometimes. But if you do, do it for good reason. So we have what we call the rule on rules. The rule on rules is unless there's a good reason to do otherwise. Unless there is a good reason to do otherwise. And that's what we call the rule on rules. No matter what the rule is, every rule may have good reasons to do otherwise. Now, whether a good reason to do otherwise is good enough is often a judgment call. So if you're going to break any of these do not rules, do it for a reason that you believe is good enough. In fact, the better you can calculate the need, rather than just feel your way through it, the more likely you will be doing well. Because sometimes when we're feeling our way through it, what we're really feeling our way through is our own feelings, our own grief, our own crisis, or our own discomfort with someone's grief and someone's crisis. And so we end up sharing our own experience, or we end up telling a story because we want to avoid the pain, and we want to avoid the pain of their pain. Because we're uncomfortable with their problem, we're uncomfortable with their challenge, we're uncomfortable with their grief, we're uncomfortable with their crisis. And so don't let this just be a feel, well, I felt like. So try to calculate that. Step back out of the feeling and try to think, is this a good enough reason? Is this really, seriously, honestly going to help them? Not just, will this help? It might help me. It might help me feel better. And I might even tell my own experience and segue into some story I heard and then get caught up in all the different rabbit trails like a regular conversation. And I feel fine. I leave and go, I feel pretty good about that. Why? Because I feel comforted. I feel distracted. I feel like I'm out of my pain and grief because I was going through some serious discomfort with their grief. But meanwhile, I've left them as bad or worse than I found them. And if the purpose of being with someone in grief, if the purpose for being with someone in crisis is to be there with them and for them, I need to make sure that they are the focus. So I only break the do not rules on purpose, exercising wise judgment by thinking first. Think it through. As you think your way through it and conclude logically, will this be a help to them? And if not, then stick to the do not rules. If not, I don't share my experience. I will mention it and drop it. So I tell them there's a door here, the door is open for you if you want to walk through. I'm just letting you know. But I'm not going to grab your hand and drag you through the door. Here's something that I've heard. If you want to know more, we can talk about it. But again, here's a door. I open the door for you. If you want to go through the door, you are invited. But I'm not going to grab your arm and drag you through the door. And all these other do not rules are similar. If you are going to break the rules, calculate whether you really, honestly, sincerely believe it will be better for them and helpful to them if you break one of these rules. That there's a good reason to break the rule, and you believe it's a good enough reason to break, not even borderline. You're pretty darn sure that this is one of those moments I really need to break this rule. And just keep in mind that if you're wrong, you really could make them feel worse. And there are, from time to time, pivot points, sort of your moments of truth in certain relationships. A lot of relationships are pretty resilient, but there's certain points of emotional intensity, there's certain moments of behavioral choices upon which an entire relationship may turn. And if we handle one of those moments poorly enough, we may create a shift in the relationship in a direction we don't want to create. If our relationship with them is always somewhat nominal, we may just flat out end it. When I was being there for the grieving family, I mean, this is their first real interaction with me. This is their first real time with me in their presence. If I handle it poorly, this will be my reputation with them forever. And thus, also including anyone and everyone they ever talk to about me. Which therefore, by extension, means everyone and anyone they talk to about me, which will reflect on me, which will reflect on this church, which will reflect on the people in the church, which will reflect on my dojo, which will reflect on the people in the dojo, and so on and so on. And so if, say, you're a member of QX Church, or you're a member of a group I am responsible for, and you're doing something and they know you as representative of the church, or representative of the dojo, or representative of any given group, and that's how they perceive it. At that moment of crisis, that moment of emotional intensity, a relationship may shift. Now, likewise, if you handle these moments well, it can also shift the other way. And it can establish a reputation. That they can know you are a good person to come to with stuff like this. And the people who are probably similar equipped as you have been are therefore probably also likely good people to come to in moments like this. And if you can be a good person to come to in a moment like this, then you're probably a good person to come to in other moments that maybe are less intense, less crisis. Now, this isn't just a self-serving thing. That if we are properly equipped, then they won't go to the people who aren't. That if we can show them that we know how to help you, then we draw them closer to the prepared, which gives them a place to go. And that even when things are much less intense, that they know this is a place you can come. I'm someone you can talk to. The people who are similarly equipped with the tools that I'm equipped with are good people to talk to. The people who are prepared in the way you see me prepared are good people to talk to. And even if they never do, just knowing that there are prepared people, equipped people, that are there, that they don't have to always face all of the rule breakers, the people who will always tell their own story. That they can just take comfort in knowing that if they need you, if they need us, you're here, we're here. And that itself offers comfort. If you determine there's a good enough reason to break one or more of the do not rules, go ahead. Go ahead. But do it purposefully. Because you decide there's a need. Now here's some more of my do not rules. And these are some things that I literally remind myself of in the middle of being there. When I'm listening to someone, when I'm talking to someone, when I'm coaching, when I'm counseling, when I'm pastoring, when I'm praying. Here's a top one. Do not argue. Do not argue. It's stunning how often people argue with grieving people. Now is not the time. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe they're just seeing things in a skewed way right now. Maybe they're angry. Well, Think about stages of grief: denial and anger. So in their anger, they may be stating propositions that you know are wrong because they're angry. Has anyone here ever said something when you're angry that you may not have said if you weren't angry? That's probably pretty darn close to 100% of us. And if anger is part of the grieving process, and someone is in intense grief, having suffered an intense loss, and they are in crisis, what will be the scale of that anger, the scale of that fury? Now is not the time to argue. When I'm sitting and I have a grieving mother, and she's furious. You can see her hands shaking with her pain and her rage. And she points at me and says, "I blame you, Pastor." Hey, I have every argument in the world why it's not my fault. Now is not the time. Do not argue when someone is in grief. Do not argue when someone is in crisis. Anger is a normal part of grief. Now is not the time to fight with them. That's okay. Just leave it. Let them grieve. Let them walk this through. Similar to do not argue is do not correct. I think, I'm not arguing with them. I'm just, they just saw something in an incorrect way. I was just correcting them. I'm helping them see it the right way. People get things wrong when they're grieving. I mean, what is the first piece of grieving in your classic model is denial. Denial is a fundamental denial of reality. They're rejecting a truth. When emotion is high, intellect is low. And if you recall from last time, what is the psychological purpose of denial? It's to hold the truth at bay and only let it in measures I can handle right now. And so when people are in denial during times of intense grief, it's because they're grappling with whatever they can grapple with. I can't handle that right now. I'm going to pretend it's not true. And they're not pretending as just being playful with it. Just psychologically, their mind can't wrap itself around that yet. And so they will get reality wrong when they're in denial. And this is not at all unusual. If someone's angry, they may get reality wrong because it's being filtered through their anger. When they're in bargaining, they may get reality wrong because they want to trade the untradeable. When they're depressed, they may get reality wrong because they're lost in darkness. And they may not get reality right until they're beginning to open up into the blue skies of acceptance. And in the middle of that pain, in the middle of that crisis, in the middle of that grief, is not the time to keep correcting people. We are not the fact police. When viewed through the lens of emotional intensity, reality looks different. Leave it. Let them be wrong right now. It's okay. We don't always have to be right 100% of the time. And I don't have to police every single fact in someone else's life, especially when my stated purpose is to be there for them in their grief. Their skewed reality may be part of their coping mechanism. Their denial of certain truths may be part of their coping mechanism. And if someone's in denial because their mind can't handle all of that right now, and I shove that into their life, I could break them. and let them walk through their own process. Now is not the time. Maybe later, maybe never. There's a pretty decent chance they'll probably sort it out themselves at whatever level they normally sort things out themselves. Or maybe they won't. And if you're going to break that rule, you better be pretty darn sure this needs to be broken, and it needs to be broken right here, right now. People are in enough pain without making them also feel like they're wrong and they're stupid. Here's another one. Do not dismiss. This is another version of dealing with intensely emotional people. We just dismiss their emotion. Or we dismiss what they say when they're emotional. Pay attention. Be there for them. This is their reality right now. Be present. Ponder why they may feel this way. Consider why they think that. They may have intense emotion about something they're incorrect about. Don't correct them anyway. Listen. Be there. It's hard sometimes when I'm showing up as pastor and I've got a mother and a father who have lost their daughter. I've got a sister who's lost her sister. And I'm still going through some of my own stuff. It's not nearly what they're going through. But it's enough that it's a weight on me. And yet, to be there, fully present, really listening, really paying attention, really hearing them, connecting with them, being open-hearted, even though it is raking me over the coals, even though it is draining me and leaving me empty. I'm being there for them. This is not the time for me to be guarding my own heart. I'm being there for them. And you have to be prepared for that when you walk in. And I may be tempted to get dismissive of their emotion because I'm reaching my limit. Because I don't like this feeling of getting drained. It's hard to be fully present with people who are in that much pain. But that's what we're there for. And to do it. And then just to understand I could be drained to nothing. And then I could do the things that I need to do to get filled again later. It's going to be a long time before that family can recover from this. I can. It's not my daughter. It's not my sister. I'll be much more likely to be okay, a lot more okay, a lot faster than they will. Be there for them without disconnecting from what they're going through. If we know someone is in grief, they should not be expected to be logical. They should be expected to be emotional. Their feelings are an important part of the process, so show respect for their feelings. Show respect for what they're going through. And I'll tell you, for myself, I still haven't gotten much refilled. I mean, I was at nothing before I left that house. And then a couple of days later, I had the funeral to do. And I felt at zero by the time I was done with that funeral. And as I've been working my way through it, just at my scale, because of my certain limitations in my life, certain other things going on in my life, I might feel like I may be running around 10% right now, doing things at half speed. But that's no excuse to not be there for the family, for mom, for dad, for sister, for the close friends. But part of the motivation for teaching this is so that other people besides just me can do this for people. So that as things happen within our circles and our periphery, it doesn't all have to land on my shoulders. That any of us can willingly, with good equipping, with having been prepared, take up as much of the burden as you might be interested in and willing to undertake. Another do not. Do not logic. I'm using logic as a verb here. Do not logic. Sometimes people try to use logic to get people out of their emotion. Don't. So we go all the way back to when my dad died. And someone says, well, you know, and they won't use it quite this vocabulary, but this is the implied meaning. Like, well, logically, you have to understand that since your father smoked and your father drank, it's completely logical to understand that he would get cancer. Okay? Now is not the time for that. If someone's going through the loss, they'll say, well, you know, you have to understand with the lifestyle this person led. You know, with the depression that they were going through, we should have expected, you know, it's perfectly logical to see how that happened. Now is not the time. To work through the grief, they need to get through it. And if you try to logic them out of their emotion, you're pulling them out of their grief, which means you're short-circuiting the process. Logic may be a help later. Perhaps a tiny bit here or there may help them get through it. But just provide a tool to help them. To help them through the pain, not pulling them out of their emotion. And offer it and then drop it. Just like the opening the door. Just letting them know there's a door here it's open to if you want to walk through. There's a logic here. Here it is. If you want to use it, it's here for you. It exists. But I'm not going to impose it on you. Let them pick it up if they choose. Now here is another very, very common one in society. Platitudes. Do not platitude. Again, using this as a verb. Do not platitude. It's a huge one. Don't do it. Drop the platitudes. Just drop it. They're in pain. All the platitudes people use to help people not hurt anymore can do damage. They may be intended as a comfort, and sometimes they are, but they can also do damage. It can make things worse. Things like, well, they're at peace now. Family I was sitting with had heard that one again and again and again, and they were sick of it. Because here's the simple logic of it. And now I didn't say this to the family because it's irrelevant to their grief. This is what the mom said. This, I'm not in pain because she's at peace. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? And you're telling some, well, you shouldn't be in pain because she's at peace. I shouldn't hurt at the loss of my dad because he's at peace. And so that's an effort to make a comfort that almost feels like to some people, well, why are you grieving? Why are you so upset that someone's at peace? Why are you hurting that they're out of pain? You're so selfish. I mean, that's almost what it feels like to a lot of people. Now, if they say it, well, he's at peace now. It's a comfort to the one who says it. It's not always a comfort to the one who hears it. To the one who hears it, sometimes it feels like an indictment. Like, how dare you feel bad for someone being at peace? How dare you? And that's what it felt like to the parents. Like, you're in pain? You're angry because she's at peace? And they needed someone who understood that it's not about her being at peace. It's about the parent being in pain. Or, you'll get over it. I know it hurts right now, but it's okay, you'll get over it. It may seem like a comforting thing to say, just to remind someone that in the course of time, they'll feel better. And I told them, you'll never get over it. I don't expect you to get over it, ever. You will learn to live with it. That they can hear. That they can accept. That was me undermining these platitudes people keep dropping on them and telling them, ignore the platitude. When someone says you'll get over it, you can ignore that. That's that person trying to make themselves feel better. You won't get over it. There will never be a period in your life where you go, she's gone, big deal. But you will learn to live with it. You will live with this reality. And it may always hurt. You may feel okay about it later. And you may never feel okay about it. But either way, you will learn to live with it. That they can hear. But when you drop platitudes, we're in danger of doing damage. Let them say things like that. We don't. Platitudes comfort the speaker. Whether they comfort the hearer is kind of a hit and miss. It may comfort them, it may make it worse. We let them say it. We don't say it to them. We don't say it at them. And then here's a believer sin. Do not theology them. Do not theology, again, the verb. Believers do this all the time. Even with other believers, a time of grief is not a time to drop theology on them. Especially when the theology leads to a bad outcome. Because if you're not sure someone accepted Christ, and so the theology says from a particular church that they're going to burn in hell for that, that is not the time to say stuff like that. In general, leave the theology alone. Like with platitudes. If they say it, it can be a comfort. If they have things to say that are going to be intensely negative, like if someone comes from a tradition that says suicide is a mortal sin and there's been a suicide, or someone comes from a tradition that you have to be water baptized by immersion by a disciple of a given church, and someone's going to be talking about one of these theological points of view that points at this person being in hell. And I had someone, express this to me, and I interrupt because I don't want that being dumped on everyone around me, and say, look, let me give you a basic of my perspective. I believe God is a loving God, and I trust Him. I can't speak to exactly what's right and exactly what's wrong because, frankly, we don't know 100% absolutely for sure. We may believe with certainty, but we really don't know. I do know the character of my God. And when the Bible says God is love, I trust God. And that whatever the outcome, I'm trusting that God is doing the loving thing. and drop it there. We don't need to get into theology now. Now is not the time. Same thing when theology contradicts the feelings they're going through. And sometimes in an offer of comfort, you say, well, God is on his throne. Oh, this is the Lord's will. God works in mysterious ways. And all of these kind of theological platitudes, they don't always help. Sometimes they do enormous damage and we don't even realize it. So don't. Just don't. Not now. And an even bigger one is absolutely never drop theology on a non-believer. Theological discussions are to be had far removed from grieving. So those are some of my not rules. A few more guidelines here. One is to keep the grief in a larger context. This is a bit of a challenge. Sometimes we say things during times of grief that can be comforting during the time of grief, but damaging in the larger context. So we have to remember that the things that we offer in times of grief also have a broader implication. This is a more expansive part of the do not rules for grief itself. There's something else I don't do when people are grieving is I don't agree with things I know are wrong. I'll leave it. I won't correct them. I won't argue with them. But I also won't affirm them. I'll express my understanding of their perspective. I'll just remain silent. But I'm not going to affirm something I know is wrong. And you have to be careful about other certain things. We need to be aware of the impact of what we're saying to a larger context. A friend of mine, talking about a celebrity suicide, had noted how many people were saying, well, they're out of pain now. Now they're at peace. It's like now they're no longer depressed. Well, think about a depressed person hearing this. Saying, oh, I'm depressed. So if I kill myself, I can be at peace. I want to be at peace. Oh, if I kill myself, I'll be in glory. I want to be in glory. And so there's a broader context to some of these things we need to keep in mind. That I'm here to be a comfort to the grieving, but I also want to make sure that I don't introduce ideas and tools that are going to be damaging in the long term, and damaging beyond the grief context, and even damaging in the grief context. Because what if I manage to convince, say, the family of a young man who committed suicide, that by committing suicide, he's gotten out of his pain. He's gotten out of his anger. He's gotten out of his crisis. And now the family's in crisis. And the family's in pain. And the family feels depressed. And I've just sold them solution suicide. Is that the solution I want to be selling? No. So I have to be careful about the things that you introduce sometimes. Because what's meant to be a comfort can sometimes become a complication. You don't want to make it worse. You don't want to make it harder. You don't want to try to offer comfort right here and do damage out there. So we need to consider the impact of what we're saying in the larger context. If we minimize the theology, we minimize the platitude, we can eliminate those as much as we can altogether, we have a much better chance of avoiding this mistake. Because there's a larger context and this moment of grief. We need to do the right thing in this moment of grief, but we also need to be doing the right thing in the larger context as well. Now, this one can be challenging. Often the grieving person will do this and will leave it though. well, they'll say something that we've got to, in a broader context, that statement could be a problem. But this is part of the grieving process, and we may decide to just leave it. But again, that's a judgment call. That's back to the rule on rules. Unless there's a good reason to do otherwise. If we suspect that they're leading themselves to a suicide solution, we might want to look for an intervention or an addition to help steer them away from that as an option. But we have to make the judgment call, because if you push back the wrong way, they could end up pushing into it stronger. And if you're really concerned that that's where they might be going, you might want to get some help from someone who is better trained at stuff like that, who's a professional at it. So for this one, just remember, people are whole people. This grief isn't the only thing in their entire lives ever. This moment isn't the only moment in their lives, but this is a crucial one. The loss that they suffer, that whatever that connection is, isn't the only role they have in life. Although it's supposed theoretically it's possible it may be, but almost never is that going to be the case. They are whole people. And they are whole people, and they have whole lives. And how you handle moments of intensity, how you handle moments of crisis, and whether or not you somehow make yourself the author of their moment of crisis, or one who exacerbates their crisis, or one who helps them through their crisis, may have a lasting impact, a lasting influence on their lives, and how they can show up for other people and be there for other people. So we try to do our best. None of us will be perfect, especially if we're also going through some of our own stuff. I mean, I knew I had to be exceptionally careful when I was with the family, and I had to be exceptionally careful when I'm doing the funeral, because I know I'm going through some of my own stuff with this. And on top of that, I've got a big pile-on going on in my life. And that doesn't give me an excuse to handle stuff poorly. That gives me a responsibility to be more careful about it. Because I know I've got this pile-on going on in my life. And so I have to be much more aware of the principles in operation, much more aware of the decisions and the choices I'm making about my connections and my relationships. I'm much more intentional about it because I know I'm at zero. Because I'm also a whole person. I also have a whole life. And when I'm going to be there for someone in grief, when I'm going to be there to do a funeral, and I'm going to be there to be a comfort, I need to handle it well for them, because that's why I'm there. It can flip if someone's being here for me, but not when I'm being there for them. And to understand that being there for them is not being there for them for me. It's for them. So last time we talked about rule number 1, let them grieve. The way out is through, and just be with them. Let them feel, guide only actions. To remember that grief is very individual. It can be immediate or delayed, can involve denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. People can be resilient. People can recover. They do. But sometimes people get stuck too. To remember that we don't get to decide how someone else grieves, and we don't get to decide how someone else recovers. To remember when we're being there for them, don't make it about you. Don't make it about your story. If you plan to pray, ask first and follow the same do not rules when you're praying with someone out loud. To remember that the do not rules are judgment calls. The rule on rules applies. But these are the rules you follow unless there is a good reason to do otherwise, and you make that as a calculation. And the more you are in your own process, the more you're grappling with feelings about stuff, the more you have to step out of your own feelings and have that be a calculation. And if you're not sure, stick to the rules. Among the rules is do not argue, do not correct, do not dismiss, do not logic, do not platitude, do not theology. And with whatever you decide to say, keep the grief in a larger context. We are all whole people. All of us. I am, you are. Someone who's grieving is, someone we've lost is. We all have whole lives. And we keep this in context. And we be there for them. The reason I know I can be there for them and I can run myself all the way down to zero is because I am also a whole person. I also have a whole life. And I can do what I need to do for this moment, for this season. And because I'm a whole person, I know I have a lot of other things going on in life. Some of them are a pile on, and I don't let that interfere with my moment. Some of it is great. So I know I can recover. I have a whole life. I've been through stuff. So far, 100% of the time, I've gotten through to the other side. So the stuff I've got going on now, I'd say my track record shows I'll probably be okay. So I can do this for other people. It's okay for me to exhaust myself, to be there for someone else's grief. I don't have to protect myself when I'm trying to be there for someone else. If I'm going to do this for them, I need to do this for them. So these couple of lessons about being there for someone who's in grief helps us help others get through it. Helps us help others even sometimes just survive it. And that's what we're doing when we're being there for people who are grieving. And next time we're going to talk a little bit about going through grief. Now I will tell you, before we get that queued up next week, trying to learn how to go through grief when you're already in grief is a bit of a challenge. So for those of you not currently grieving, who might be thinking, okay, well, I might have liked to learn how to help people through their grief, because you never know. It's like, I don't really know how to go through grief because I'm not really grieving anything right now. Being prepared for certain things are among the skills you kind of need to have before you need them. Just like physical self-defense. You don't wait for the bad guy to attack. Go, whoa, 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 hang on. Let me go learn some self-defense techniques. The more you can learn about how to go through your own grief, how to go through your own crisis, how to face challenges and problems of a significant magnitude, knowing how to do that before it happens means that when it happens, and it's just a matter of time for everyone, that when it happens, you can be prepared. And our society these days, by and large, does a really poor job of preparing us. So we have to be a bit more intentional about it. And that will be next time, as we talk about, in the series on grieving, of going through it and being prepared beforehand to go through it. And for those of us already in the middle of a grieving process, it may be a little harder to hear and apply. And that's okay. It may still be helpful for you. So I encourage you to listen, to watch, to be here. I appreciate the people who listen to these couple of messages to learn more about how to be there for others. And of course, as I'm sure you've noticed, it doesn't apply just for people who are grieving the death of a loved one. Because we can grieve a lot of things. We can sometimes even grieve what might seem like it should be good things. I mean, sometimes people have just tremendous sadness over an empty nest. Or they go through tremendous grief over the loss of a marriage, the loss of a relationship, the loss of a job or a career, even moving, even something that they chose for themselves. And there's elements that they're still trying to cope with. And for some of us, some of these moments are much more intense than we expected that they would be. And that'll happen. And that's okay. And it might not always apply at the same scale, of course. That you may find some of these things are being there for people through intense grieving of the loss of an intimately loved one. Also applies at some level and in some way to many other pains that you may be helping people go through over the course of your life. Because what impacts someone is going to be very individual. And the same rules apply. And so it can be very helpful in a lot of contexts. Likewise, the next lesson. That when you're going through your own stuff, it may not just be the death of an intimate loved one, but at some other scale, it could be any other loss, any other significant change that affects you in some deep emotional way. So I encourage you to continue on into the next lesson as well. I appreciate you learning this, and I hope that it will be of help to you in being able to be there for other people. Thank you very much.